Hi, Aqua Roomers. It's time for chapter reading. Yesterday, Pa finished the house. I want to show you the picture again. Look at that. Do you remember when he built the fireplace? And then he finished the roof. And the last thing he did was the floor. My goodness. And then he filled all of the cracks in between the logs with mud so that there wouldn't be any wind or rain to come in. And they call that chinking. That's a different kind of a word, isn't it? Yeah. So, here we go. I wish we had glass for the windows, Pa said. We don't need glass, Charles, said Ma. Just the same, if I do well with my hunting and trapping this winter, I'm going to get some glass in Independence next spring, said Pa, and hang the expense. Glass windows would be nice if we can afford them, said Ma, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. They were all happy that night. The fire on the hearth was pleasant. For the high prairie, even the summer nights were cool. The red check cloth was on the table. The little china woman glimmered on the mantel shelf, and the new floor was golden in the flickering firelight. Outside, the night was large and full of stars. Pa sat for a long time in the doorway and played his fiddle and sang to Mary and Laura and Ma in the house and to the starry night outside. Ooh, chapter 11. Indians in the house. Ooh, looks like Pa is headed off to go hunting. And there's Jack. He's tied up. I don't think he likes that. Early one morning, Pa took his gun and went hunting. He had meant to make the bedstead that day. He brought in the slabs when Ma said she had no meat for dinner. So he stood the slabs against the wall and took down his gun. Jack wanted to go hunting too. His eyes begged Pa to take him, and whines came up from his chest and quivered in his throat till Laura almost cried with him. But Pa chained him to the stable. No, Jack, Pa said, you must stay here and guard the place. And then he said to Mary and Laura, don't let him loose. Poor Jack. He lay down. It was a disgrace to be chained, and he felt it deeply. He turned his head from Pa. He would not watch him going away. Pa went farther and farther away till the prairie swallowed him and he was gone. Laura tried to comfort Jack, but he would not be comforted. The more he thought about the chain, the worse he felt. Laura tried to cheer him up to frisk and play, but he only grew more sullen. Both Mary and Laura felt that they could not leave Jack while he was so unhappy. So all that morning, they stayed by the stable. They stroked Jack's smooth head, and they scratched around his ears, and they told him how sorry they were that he must be chained. He lapped their hands a little bit, but he was very sad and angry. His head was on Laura's knee, and she was talking to him, when suddenly he stood up and growled, a fierce, deep growl. The hair on his neck stood straight up and his eyes glared red. Laura was frightened. Jack never growled at her before. And then she looked over her shoulder where Jack was looking, and she saw two wild men coming, one behind the other, on the Indian trail. "Mary, look," she cried. Mary looked and saw them too. They were tall, thin, fierce-looking men. Their skin was brownish red. Their heads seemed to go up in a peak, and the peak was a tuft of hair that stood up and ended in feathers. Their eyes were black and still and glittering, like snakes' eyes. They came closer and closer, and then they went out of sight on the other side of the house. Laura's head turned, and so did Mary's, and they looked at the place where those men would appear when they came past the house. "Indians," Mary whispered. Laura had a funny feeling in her middle, and the bones in her legs felt weak. She wanted to sit down, but she stood and she looked and she waited for the Indians to come out from behind the house. The Indians did not do that. All this time, Jack had been growling, and now he stopped growling and was lunging against the chain. His eyes were red, his lips curled back, and all the hair on his back was bristling. He bounded and bounded clear off the ground, trying to get loose from the chain. Laura was glad that the chain kept him right there with her. "Jack's here," she whispered to Mary. "We'll be safe if we stay close to Jack." "They're in the house," whispered Mary. "They're in the house with Ma and Carrie." And then Laura began to shake all over. She knew she must do something. She did not know what the Indians were doing in the house. There was no sound at all. "What are they doing?" she screamed in a whisper. "I don't know," Mary whispered. "I'm going to let Jack loose," Laura whispered. "Jack will get them." "Pa said not to," Mary answered. They were too scared to speak out loud. They put their heads together and watched the house and whispered. "He didn't know that Indians would come," Laura said. "He said not to let Jack loose." Mary was almost crying. Laura thought of baby Carrie and Ma shut in the house, and she said, "I'm going in to help Ma." She ran 2 steps, and she walked a step. Then she turned and she flew back to Jack. She clutched him and hung onto his strong, panting neck. Jack wouldn't let anything hurt her. "We mustn't leave Ma in there alone," Mary whispered. She stood still. She trembled. Mary never could move when she was frightened. Do you remember when they lived in the big woods and they played the game of Mad Dog with Pa? And when Mary got scared, she just couldn't move. Laura hid her face against Jack, and she held on to him tightly. And then she made her arms let go. Her hands balled into fists, her eyes shut tight. She ran toward the house as fast as she could run. She stumbled and fell, and her eyes popped open. She sat up again and was running before she could think. Mary was close behind her. They came to the door. It was open. They slipped into the house without a sound. The men stood by the fireplace. Ma was bending over the fire, cooking something. Carrie clung to Ma's skirts with both hands, and her head was hidden in the folds of her dress. Laura ran toward Ma, but just as she reached the hearth, she smelled a horribly bad smell, and she looked up at the Indians. Quick as a flash, she ducked behind the long, narrow slab that leaned up against the wall. The slab was just wide enough to cover both her eyes. If she held her head perfectly still and pressed her nose against the slab, she couldn't see the Indians, and she felt safer, but she couldn't help moving her head just a little so that one eye peeped out and she could see the men. First, she saw their leather moccasins, like slippers. Then their stringy bare brown legs, all the way up around their waists. Each of the Indians wore a leather thong, and a furry skin of a small animal hung down the front. The fur was striped black and white. And now Laura knew what made that smell. The skins were fresh skunk skins. Oh my goodness. I have to show you the picture. So, there's Laura. She came into the house, and there's the slab of wood that Pa was going to use to make the bed. And there are the Indians. Their skin is darker. They're wearing moccasins. And in their front, skunk skin, skunk fur. And look at their hair. It's beautiful. See? And it's tied with feathers. I think they were just hungry. So Ma is cooking for them. Their faces were bold. Their eyes glittered. High on their forehead and above their ears, where hair grows, these wild men had no hair. But on the top of their heads, a tuft of hair stood straight up. It was wound around with string, and feathers were stuck in it. The Indians' ribs made little ridges up and down their bare sides. Their arms were folded on their chest, and Laura looked again at their faces, and then she dodged back behind the slab. When Laura peeked out again from behind the slab, both Indians were looking straight at her. Her heart jumped into her throat and choked her with its pounding. Two black eyes shined down on her eyes. The Indian did not move. Not one muscle of his face moved. Only his eyes shone. They sparkled at her. Laura didn't move. She didn't even breathe. The Indian made two short, harsh sounds in his throat. The other Indian made one sound like, ha. Laura hid her eyes behind the slab again. She heard Ma take the cover off the bake oven. She heard the Indians squat down on the hearth. After a while, she heard them eating. Laura peeked and hid and peeked again while the Indians ate the cornbread that Ma had baked. And we'll read more about this. But their eyes sparkled at Laura. So, they're different looking. And sometimes, we've talked about this before, sometimes people are afraid of somebody that looks very, very different. Somebody might look different on the outside, but be the same on the inside. Gloria looks a little different on the outside. She's the same on the inside. So, more tomorrow. Bye, Aqua Roomers.